Before we begin, if you value serious research-driven explorations of overlooked survival history, consider subscribing to The Prepper Historian. This channel exists for those who want more than surface-level summaries. Those who understand that the smallest forgotten tools often shaped the greatest outcomes. Most people think survival in cold weather warfare came down to parkas, rations and firepower. When we talk about the Korean War, the common narrative focuses on frozen rifles at the Chosun Reservoir, inadequate winter gear, and the shock of sub-zero temperatures. But here's what is rarely discussed. In extreme cold, the difference between life and death was often not clothing or ammunition. It was fire discipline. Specifically, how heat was managed, directed, and concealed. Open flame in winter is both salvation and liability. It keeps men alive. It also reveals position. And, well, long before Korea and long before World War I, one American woodsman had already solved part of this problem. His name was Horace Kephart, and the log fire reflector he documented more than a century ago still works today. Quietly, efficiently, and honestly, with surprising tactical relevance. Let's look at what most modern survivalists have forgotten. Horace Kephart understood that wilderness survival was about efficiency, not comfort. Horace Kephart was not a soldier in the conventional sense. He was a librarian turned woodsman, a student of Appalachian life, and the author of Camping and Woodcraft, first published in the early 1900s. Yet, his influence on practical American survival culture is really difficult to overstate. Kephart studied mountain communities that had no surplus, no redundancy, and, well, no room for inefficiency. Firewood had to last. Heat had to be directed. Smoke had to be managed. Everything was deliberate. The log fire reflector was not an invention in the industrial sense. It was a refinement, a system drawn from backwoods tradition and optimized through careful observation. Kephart recorded it not as folklore, but as applied fieldcraft. He understood something modern campers often miss. An open fire wastes most of its heat. Radiation travels outward in all directions. Without a surface to reflect and concentrate it, you are heating the night air more than yourself. The log fire reflector was designed to turn a small fire into a controlled heat system. The design is simple. Behind your fire, opposite where you sit or sleep, you construct a wall of green logs, not dry logs. Green wood resists ignition and slows charring. The wall is stacked tightly, often slightly angled inward toward the fire. This wall does three things simultaneously. First, it reflects radiant heat forward, concentrating warmth toward the user rather than dispersing it. Second, it shields wind from striking the back of the fire, stabilizing combustion and reducing fuel waste. Third, it increases efficiency, meaning a smaller fire can produce the same usable warmth as a larger, more exposed one. Kephart emphasized proportion. The reflector should be roughly as long as your body if you intend to sleep beside it. The fire itself should not be large and theatrical. It should be long and narrow, what he called a long fire, so that heat distribution matches the length of your resting position. This is not decorative camping. It's heat engineering using raw materials. The same principle quietly shaped cold weather survival in 20th century conflicts. By the time American and United Nations forces were fighting in Korea's mountainous winters, temperatures routinely plunged below zero. The problem was not merely cold. It was sustained exposure combined with limited fuel and the constant risk of enemy observation. Soldiers learned quickly that large fires were a liability. Smoke columns in frozen air travel far. Bright flames against snow are visible from distance. Yet men still needed heat to prevent frostbite, maintain morale, and dry equipment. What field manuals increasingly emphasized, sometimes indirectly, was control, shielding, direction. Improvised reflectors made from stacked ammunition crates, sandbags, snow walls, and even vehicle parts were used to trap and direct heat. The principle was identical to Kephart's Appalachian reflector wall. Capture radiation, minimize waste, conceal flame signature. You know, the concept is actually older than the Korean War. But that conflict really demonstrated just how unforgiving winter can be when heat discipline fails. And this is the overlooked lesson. Survival in extreme cold isn't about building the biggest fire. It's about building the most efficient one. Building the Kephart log fire reflector today is both simple and honestly quite instructive. If you were to construct it now, here's how you would approach it with historical fidelity. First, select green logs that are, say, roughly wrist to forearm thick. The length should match the intended heating area. Ideally, that's 6 to 8 feet for a single sleeper. Stack them horizontally in a low wall, about 2 to 3 feet high. If you need a bit more stability, just drive stakes into the ground behind the wall. Position the wall 1 to 2 feet behind where your fire will burn. Build a long, narrow fire parallel to the wall, not a pyramid and not a cone. What you want is a linear bed of coals that can be fed gradually along its length. In front of the fire, where you sleep, place a natural barrier, if available a fallen log, packed earth, or even a slight trench to reduce airflow beneath you. If snow is present, compact it firmly. Snow insulates when compressed. The reflector will darken and char over time, but because it is green wood, it will not ignite quickly. As heat radiates backward, the wall re-radiates forward, effectively doubling perceived warmth. You will notice something immediately if you test this. You feel heat not just from flame, but from the wall itself. It becomes a thermal battery. This is the detail most casual survival guides omit. You know, the reflector system teaches a deeper lesson about energy conservation. Kephart's writing, well, it reveals a mindset that is increasingly rare these days. He was not impressed by spectacle, not at all. He favoured controlled burn rates, steady coal beds, and systems that required less maintenance overnight. In prolonged winter conditions, honestly, energy conservation becomes strategic. Cutting wood costs calories. Moving in snow costs calories too. Poor fire design, well, that just multiplies effort. The log reflector, you see, reduces wood consumption. It stabilizes flame, and it shortens the time required to achieve usable warmth. In military terms, that translates to reduced logistical strain. In civilian survival terms, it means longer endurance with finite resources. This is why it still works today. Not because it is romantic or traditional, but because physics has not changed. Radiant heat behaves the same way now as it did in 1906. Why did modern outdoor culture quietly drift away from these systems? Well, part of the answer is convenience. Manufactured gear replaced fieldcraft. Reflective emergency blankets, insulated sleeping pads, Lightweight stoves. These reduce dependence on constructed fire systems. Another factor is land regulation. In many public lands, large wood cutting for reflector walls is restricted. The technique faded from mainstream camping literature because it was seen as unnecessary, or, maybe a bit impractical under new rules. But the underlying principle remains relevant wherever wood fires are permitted. Control heat direction, reduce signature, increase efficiency. For preppers and serious historians, the value is not nostalgia. It is adaptability. If modern equipment fails, or is unavailable, the knowledge of how to turn raw timber into a heat amplifier remains actionable. The forgotten fire reflector reminds us that survival knowledge accumulates quietly. There is a tendency in military history to focus on dramatic innovations, new weapons, vehicles, technologies. But survival often depends on quiet refinements. The log fire reflector did not win battles. It did not alter treaties. But multiplied across cold nights, across generations, it prevented frostbite, preserved strength, and allowed men to wake up functional rather than debilitated. In the Korean mountains, in Appalachian hollows, in any cold backcountry, directed heat meant preserved manpower. Kephart documented what mountain families already knew. The military rediscovered variations under pressure. Modern survivalists can relearn it without crisis. That is really the historian's advantage. The enduring relevance of Kephart's system lies in understanding principles, not just copying rituals. And if you take only one lesson from this, let it be this: do not memorize techniques without understanding why they work. So, the reflector works because, radiant heat travels in straight lines and can actually be redirected by mass. It also works since wind disrupts combustion and, shielding helps to stabilize it. And most importantly, it works because fuel efficiency is kind of like survival currency when you're out in cold environments. You could build a reflector from stone, snow blocks, earth berms, or even metal sheeting. The material matters less than the principle. Horace Kephart's contribution was not inventing firewalls. It was documenting and explaining them clearly enough that a century later we can still apply them with confidence. And that is why this so-called forgotten system deserves attention. Not as trivia, not as reenactment, but as living fieldcraft. If you test it responsibly and observe the difference in heat efficiency, you will understand what generations before us already knew. The wilderness rewards precision far more than drama. And sometimes the most enduring survival tools are not the newest, but the quietest.